Very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers who have joined us for another edition of Let's Talk. Today is Creation Sabbath. We are going to be talking about a topic that is related to creation. And for this afternoon, we, of course, have a special guest with us. I will introduce our guest in just a few minutes. Before we do that, however, we would like to invite our viewers to join us for a word of prayer, shall we? Eternal Father and our God, we ask that you will be with us as we go into this important discourse. We are discussing creation. We are talking about you and the Bible and your word and how it lines up with science. We pray for your wisdom and your guidance. We ask that you will be with all of our viewers, be with our special guests in a very special way, and grant your peace and your grace in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So viewers, wherever you are joining us from, we are delighted to have you. We know that across the South Leeward Conference, around the Caribbean Union and further afield, we have had viewers from Europe, from I know that regularly we do have viewers from France, from Puerto Rico, from Canada, and of course, North America. We welcome all of you. This afternoon, we are talking about intelligent design or theistic evolution. With us to discuss this very important subject is Miss Davley-Ann Wilson. Miss Wilson is an instructor in the Department of Biological Science at the University of the Southern Caribbean, located in Trinidad. She has 15 years of experience in preparing students for careers in biology and related health fields. Part of her current duties is to teach the class historical and philosophical biology. In this class, students explore the relationship of science, in particular, the theory of evolution and the Christian understanding of the origins of species as found in Genesis 1-11. Davley-Ann is a strong believer that there are not only good reasons for Christians to maintain their belief in God's creative power, as described in his word, but that this belief is also essential in maintaining our identity as Christians and our walk with God. We are so delighted to have Miss Wilson join us this afternoon. Sister Wilson, good afternoon and welcome to Let's Talk.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It's a pleasure having you. I encountered you first on a journey through USC. I don't remember the occasion. I know that they were having a science emphasis and various professors were presenting. I was so profoundly impressed with your presentation. I got back to where I was staying and I said to the folks who were with me, you know, all I needed to hear was that one presentation. So I am delighted to have somebody of your caliber with us this afternoon. We're talking about intelligent design.
Yes.
This morning, last evening, this morning in South Leeward Conference, we had a special emphasis on creation. And we are talking about creation. You know, in our world today, there is a lot of emphasis on the creation evolution debate. But before we get into this subject of creation and evolution, let's first clarify one thing. Many persons see science as a challenge to their belief in God. They have what I call a narrow view of science. They see science as bad. Now, from your perspective, tell us why science is a good thing, if it is indeed a good thing.
Well, it absolutely is a wonderful thing. We couldn't live our lives as we know it today without it. Science, for one, makes our lives easier. We can talk with people all around the world. We can fly to different parts of the world. If electricity goes in our home, we can't function. So it makes our lives easier. Science has also provided a way for us to extend our health and our life, have good health and extend our lives. Science helps us to understand the world around us, even understand the universe. So we can predict when hurricanes or tornadoes may be arriving and save lives in the process. We can learn about how our bodies work and how our ecosystems function. And we can describe the earth and the universe, the solar system in which we live. So those are all pretty good things. But one of the most important things is that science helps us understand God's second book to us. It reveals to us his beauty, his power, his omnipotence. I believe that science points directly to a wonderful God.
So from your perspective, there is no conflict at all with science and our Christian philosophy or perspective?
Not really. Now, in saying that, I would say that there would be apparent conflicts and there may be contradictions that at this time we may not be able to explain. However, I do believe that when one examines the evidence, it does point to an intelligent designer.
Okay, wonderful. Well, now let's talk about theories of origins. You indicated to me some time ago that as a science professor, you encounter students who have different perspectives, different worldviews. We want to talk about this concept of origins, a very important discussion in our world today. There are several theories of origins. Our concern today is the creation evolution debate. It is important, I suppose, for us to clarify that we are here talking about theories. Now, this is perhaps something I should ask you to expound on likewise. When our viewers hear that we're talking about a theory of creation and a theory of evolution, many Christians who read the Bible, they may want to challenge me and they may say, well, why are you calling creation a theory? So could you just say a word on that?
Okay, so in science, a theory is quite different from what we understand in the general basis. So oftentimes when two persons say, oh, that's a theory, or my theory on this is, it really means it's my opinion, or this is what I think about the subject matter. But in science, a theory is much different. First of all, a good theory must be able to organize and explain previously isolated facts. So there was something going on and we couldn't understand or make sense of what we were observing, but a good theory is going to help us explain those observations. And it's also going to suggest future experiments, and these experiments are going to be able to test the theory. And a theory that is really good will be able to predict the outcome of the theory. So when it predicts the outcome successfully, then we begin to have confidence in that theory. And of course, these experiments would be repeatable and suggest new experiments. And as I said, once the theory is able to predict the outcome, then we start to feel more comfortable with the theory and say, okay, there's something here. And so the theory of evolution does a really good job, but there are many who are proposing an alternative theory of partial interventionism, where there is room that God intervened in Earth's history to carry out certain miraculous events to produce the diversity of species that we see today. And by that, I'm referring to the creation story.
Well, let's continue along those lines. The average person sees evolution as a notion that man came from monkeys. I remember as a child, that's what I understood evolution to be. Your ancestors are monkeys. I had a liking for science when I was in school. I pursued it to some extent. Of course, I'm a preacher. I majored in theology, although I did an associate in natural science, etc. So I do have a liking for science. And science, as I got exposed to certain issues and topics in science, as I studied, I realized that, hey, listen, there is more to this theory of evolution than man came from monkeys. I would ask you if you can give us a better understanding of why this topic is important. Explain to our viewers in as simpler way as you can what are some of the major arguments in the evolutionary theory. If we're going to talk about creation versus evolution, we need to have an understanding of where the evolutionist is coming from, because I believe that I was reasoning just this morning, and I was thinking, if intellectuals, individuals who have bachelor's and master's and doctoral degrees hold on to something so strongly, there has to be more to it than we are a product, or we are a byproduct of monkeys.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, let me just correct that notion in that evolution doesn't say that we come from monkeys, but that monkeys and humans have a similar ancestor. But let's start off by defining a couple of terms. The first term I'd like to introduce is the term called microevolution. And microevolution refers to small changes that occur within species. And these changes are usually due to mutations in genes, and a term that I'm going to introduce later on is the selection of a particular trait. So when we have these small changes occurring in a species, over time, these small changes due to mutations, over time we can see new species forming. And this is something that we can actually observe in nature. Microevolution is an observable fact and can be seen throughout the world. Now, where there may be some conflict between the Christian ideology and naturalism would be when we get to macroevolution, which is evolution above the species level, or more importantly, at the higher phenotypic changes, like new body plans, new body structures, at the higher taxa or classifications of organisms.
Before you go to the macro, let's just clarify something else here on the micro level, because I don't want our viewers to miss this. This is, something that as you indicated, we encounter on a daily basis. I see, for example, I remember one of the things I did when I did A-level biology, or was it chemistry? I can't remember which one now. But I remember us discussing the issue of well, it must have been biology, yes. The issue of mutation. It's coming back now. And we were talking about the fact that if you use a particular insecticide to fight roaches, after a while they would develop resistance, and that insecticide would not kill them anymore, which is a change, perhaps some kind of genetic change, a micro change. And I believe this is an example of the evolutionary, the genetic adjustment on the micro level that you're talking about. Just something practical so that our viewers can get a sense of what we are saying here.
Well, what I wanted to talk about, very integral to microevolution and speciation, is something called natural selection. And natural selection is where individuals, in any given population, there's going to be variation. We're going to see different phenotypes, and by phenotype, I mean traits, of the same trait. So let me explain. So we all have eye color, but some of us are going to have brown eyes, some of us are going to have blue, gray, or hazel. So that would be examples of mutations or variations of the same gene. And these are inheritable traits. So natural selection builds on the idea of something that humans have been doing for years, and that is selective breeding. So if you have a cow that gives lots of milk, you're going to breed that cow so you will have more cows that can breed lots of milk, produce lots of milk. If you have a horse that runs very fast, you're going to give that horse many opportunities to mate because you want offspring that can run very fast. You want a particular trait, and you want those that have those traits to continue breeding so that you can get more. Well, natural selection says that the environment takes the place of the person and selects for traits that allows the individual to survive in that environment. And therefore, because that individual survives, they have more mating opportunities. And over time, we're going to see populations change because one environment may select for darker color in fur, maybe because it allows the animal to be camouflaged and get away from predators. Whereas in the Arctic, a lighter color is selected for because there's snow around there. And so you will find that rabbits and owls in the Arctic tend to be lighter in color because that's what allows them to survive and reproduce.
So can we say that that is an ability that God gave us to be able to make adjustments and to be able to perhaps increase our chances of survivability?
I wouldn't disagree with you. Natural selection is as powerful as your genetic diversity. So the greater genetic diversity you have, there's more to pull on to survive. The more limited your genetic diversity, the less likely you are able to survive environmental changes. And so we see a loss of genetic information. Christians may say that that loss is due to the reality of sin in this world. And so over time, we actually see a loss of genetic diversity.
Now we are talking about micro versus macro evolution. And the real challenge in terms of the creation evolution debates is on the macro level. So let's get into that a little bit. Go right ahead.
Okay, so there are lots of evidences cited for the support of macroevolution. Because of time today, I will only highlight three. One would be homology. If you look at the limbs, let's take the forelimbs, the arm, for example, and compare the internal structure of the arm to the wing of a bat, to the wing of a bird, to the fin of a whale, or even the front leg of a cat or a horse, you will find that the internal structure is quite similar. So they all have a humerus, a radius, and an ulnar, and digits, but they are used for completely different things. A bat uses those bones to fly. A cat walks on its forelimbs. A whale swims with that same internal mechanism, and we are able to manipulate with the same structure. So because of this similarity, this morphological similarity that we see in these mammals, evolutionists say that this is evidence that we all had a similar ancestor because the internal structure is similar. Another example, evidence comes to us from embryology. If we look at a salamander, there are some salamanders that live in the water, but many salamanders live on land today. But yet, when they go through the embryonic stages, they still produce gills. Why would a terrestrial animal still produce gills? Well, a naturalist is going to say these are vestigial. That means left over from an ancestral past that occurred in the water, where the ancestors lived in water. There's an interesting experiment I'd like to share done by Kohler and Fisher. Now, we all know that birds don't have teeth, but Kohler and Fisher took the embryonic tissue of a mouse where the jaw should form, and that tissue contains chemicals and hormones that give direction for the development of teeth. They laid this tissue over the embryo of a bird where its mouth should develop. And would you believe it? It was a chicken. The chicken developed molar teeth. How could a chicken develop molar teeth? We all know that birds don't have teeth. It means that the embryo had the genes for developing teeth, and somehow it was turned off. So an evolutionist would say the ancestor of the bird, which is thought to be reptiles, had the genes that code for teeth. And over time, the birds didn't need it to survive, and so that gene was turned off. And finally, the best evidence used for the theory, for providing evidence for the theory of evolution, is the fossil record. The fossil record consists of layers of dirt, horizontal layers of dirt, layered one on top of the other. This is easily seen in places like the Grand Canyon. If you look at any picture you're going to see of the Grand Canyon, you're going to see layers of earth. And what scientists find is that at the bottom layers, which would be the layers laid down first, the oldest layers, we find simple organisms. And as we move up to the top, the most recent layers of Earth, we're going to see more and more complex organisms. And that's one of the main reasons why evolutionists say that life began in a simple form and became more complex.
Now, it's interesting, and I know we don't have all the time in the world. I wanted to go back to reason number 2, you know, especially with the illustration with the bird and the development of the teeth, because it sounds to me as though we have a similar concept when we discuss the idea of stem cells. We take stem cells and we put them at different places in the body, and they turn into whatever organs are necessary in those areas. Could it be therefore that cells are dynamic enough to be able to make adjustments and to should I say take on characteristics depending on where it is and its usefulness?
Whatever trait that we will be able to observe is present because there is a gene there for it. Which genes get turned on is a result of a combination of different things. So, and it all has to do with the chemicals present in the cell. So whatever a stem cell will eventually develop into is dependent on what chemicals it's exposed to. But if it doesn't have the gene, there's no way it will be able to develop that structure.
I want to ask you a question. I don't know if it's well, let me go ahead and ask the question. Do we know enough, as scientists, do we know enough about genes today to determine that there are not commonalities between genes of, let's say, human beings and genes of certain other animals?
Well, we have found that there are indeed a lot of commonalities, which is another evidence for evolution, because the biochemistry of even a yeast can be quite similar to the biochemistry of a cell in your body.
Well, I mean, that's a good argument. And,
Yeah.
and I can see that evolutionists may want to use it to support their perspective, but I can also see that Christians can use it to say, listen, there are general commonalities among various things. So
well, yes. Yeah. One who's to say that God didn't have a general plan that he tweaked in order to make various persons? I mean, various types of organisms. That being said, when it came to humans, he took special time and effort to create us.
Now it's an interesting discussion because I'm aware that, you know, individuals who study science and go into details, they sometimes, as they encounter these things, they say, listen, there is a point here. You know, we sometimes wonder, why do people leave here believing that there's a God, and they go and they spend 4 6 years in a university and they come back with questions. Let me ask you outrightly, as a student of science, as somebody who has been teaching for the last several years, how clear is it in your mind that there is no significant conflict? There may be challenges, but not significant conflict between science as we know it and the Bible?
That's interesting. I think there is conflict. However, I think that there is sufficient evidence for us to determine what we believe to be truth. Hebrews 11:1 says that faith is a confidence in what we hope for, an assurance or evidence of what we don't see. And Isaiah 1 verse 18 says that God calls us to reason with him. And so while I do not believe that there is necessary conclusive evidence of a creation story, there is sufficient evidence for us to have faith. And I base that on several things. One, as Christians, we get our understanding of who God is from the Bible. And we believe that the Bible is a reliable source of truth because of its internal consistency, the prophecies that are told that come to fruition. It is recognized as a historically accurate book by even secularists. So I feel that gives us reason to consider the Bible as a reliable source of truth. Now, on the scientific side, there are several concerns that we have with the theory of evolution. One of the biggest challenges to the theory of evolution is how did life first originate from nothing? And by nothing, I mean abiotic, non-living substances. You know, in nature, we will see order, but it's a type of order that's more of a pattern than it is specificity. So for example, if I said there's order, but it's just a pattern. There's no information in it. But if I said the sky is blue, there we see order and complexity, but we see specificity. And this is something that the theory of evolution right now has been unable to explain. We have the DNA in our cells. They provide coding for all the proteins that we have in the cell and coding for the structures that we see and so forth. This is, without that DNA, you cannot have the proteins to build the organism. So if by accident, these DNA molecules came together, these molecules were accidentally formed, how did they get information in that molecule? For example, if we have a room full of monkeys and we give them computers and ask them to write a Shakespearean play, what's the likelihood of that occurring? That's the likelihood of getting a DNA molecule with specified information and the ability to build an organism. And the chances for that, the evidence for that just does not seem to be there. Another challenge, besides, and you know, there's a lot of evidence to show that whatever theories we have ever come up with to explain how life originated, none of them work. There's absolutely no evidence for how life would move from non-living to living. And then the second big challenge is, how do we get specified information, instructions on how to build a cell, a living cell, a functional cell? And then we have the complexity of the cell itself. The cell is like a little city. There are highways, there are headquarters, there are mailing services. And the cell is very organized. A lot of this information was not available to Darwin when he came up with the theory. And so today, we have a number of leading scientists who are now questioning, who have no interest in the creation story, who are purely secularists, and are now beginning to question the theory of evolution as a really strong, plausible way of explaining how origins arose. So I could not get into a lot of detail, but I think there is, while we cannot prove evolution, we cannot disprove it either. And I wanted to give a quote from Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins wrote the book, The Blind Watchmaker, and in it he says, "What is the largest single event of sheer naked coincidence, sheer unadulterated miraculous luck that we are allowed to get away with in our theories and still say we have a satisfactory explanation for life?" He's talking about the theory of evolution. So, you know, persons may say that the creation story, we don't have a whole lot of scientific evidence to prove it, but I think that there are scientific arguments that can be made to say that it is plausible. And at the same time, we see that with the theory of evolution, just for it to begin is a miraculous event. So it seems to me that both theories start off with a miraculous event. And that means that I can give equal consideration to a theory of creation. Excuse me, I have a cough.
That's fine. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier. You know, when you started answering the question, you quoted from Hebrews 11. It's interesting that God told us in the Word. I mean, Hebrews 11 is considered to be the faith chapter. So there is this component of faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. The Bible does seem to give the idea that one is going to need to require faith to believe in God, because you and I can't go out there to prove that there's a God. You know, this week, for example, at Seventh Adventist, we had in our Sabbath school lesson study the biblical worldview of creation, and there was this quote, I know because there were some persons who had a challenge with it, but it says the Bible assumes that there is God. It doesn't go about to prove that there is a God. So God knew well that he probably is not interested in proving. He doesn't have anything to prove, but we do know that there are elements that will challenge our understanding. There are some things that we cannot explain. There are some things that perhaps we will not be able to explain, but that God requires us to accept by faith. But I also hear you saying that there are lots of things in the evolutionary concept that cannot be explained and that require a tremendous amount of faith to accept them. And one of those things is, where did life come from? How do we make the difference between a carbon compound and a living compound? And I think that that is an important consideration that we must talk about when we discuss this evolutionary creation debate.
Yeah.
So, sounds like you were going to make a point.
Not really. I was just agreeing with you. And again, there's so much more to the topic. We just don't have the time to share it right now. But that's right. Where a lot of questions are being asked by secularists today. You know, there is absolutely no good explanation for how we move from non-life to life. And then we also, you know, evolution is based on the idea that there are small changes over a long period of time due to mutations. But now scientists are seeing that these mutations as an explanation for how we get new organisms or new structures is inadequate, because most mutations result in a loss of genetic information and not new structures, new traits. And the time period that is allotted for that kind of change to occur would probably not be enough, even though it's millions of years.
So I mean, you teach this class called Historical and Philosophical Biology. Among other things, the class is concerned with reconciling science and biblical understanding of creation. Let's talk about some of the reasons why, in spite of the heavy emphasis on evolution, Christians can still hold firm to the biblical perspective. You mentioned already the challenge with answering the question about the origin of life. What I'm asking now is, are there other things that we can look to as Christians and say, you know, because of this, I rather choose creation as opposed to evolution?
Well, before we even get there, if we are to maintain our integrity as Christians, we have to see what theistic evolution means for us. So, theistic evolution has many definitions. But the most common one I think you might have mentioned is this idea that God set evolution in, he set it up and then left it to create all the different species that we have. The problem with this is that in Genesis we learn that sin entered this world because man disobeyed God's instruction. And therefore, with the entrance of sin came the entrance of death. If God created all species through evolution, then it means that death existed before man came on the scene. Man is said to have evolved about 10,000 years ago, and life began 570 million years ago. Natural selection requires death. And if that's the case, then before man began to live or evolve, there would have been pain, suffering, and death. And then therefore death, or the problem of sin, is not man's fault because it was here before. And if the problem of sin is not man's fault, then what's the point of Jesus coming and dying for us? There's no need for redemption because death and sin existed before. And if Jesus didn't have to come and die for us, why do we need him to live a righteous life? And that hits at the very core of our being as Christians.
So why then, and this question, you can only share your perspective, but why then are we seeing an increase, it appears, with more and more Christians tending towards this theistic evolutionary concept?
Well, that's quite interesting. In today's scientific community, well, not just today, but yesteryear as well, if you held any other belief other than the material naturalistic view of the theory of evolution, you were considered to be an unreliable source of truth, a kook, superstitious. And many Christians believe that in order to appear to be knowledgeable, intelligent, clear-thinking persons, then they must accept the theory of evolution. In many scientific circles, if you do not subscribe to the theory of evolution, you are not considered a scientist. And so many reputable scientists who have, upon considering the evidence, said, okay, I do believe in an intelligent designer, have lost their positions. So you have many Christians who are trying to marry the two, but it's not possible. Interestingly, in the year 2016, the Royal Society in London held their yearly symposium, and the opening speaker for that symposium was Dr. Müller. He's an Austrian evolutionary theorist. And the summation of that presentation was printed in the Society's journal under the title, Why an Extended Evolutionary Synthesis is Necessary. And in that, Müller says that the current evolutionary theory largely avoids the questions of how the complex organizations of organismal structure, physiology, development, or behavior actually arise in evolution. That's just a fancy way of talking about the challenges that we were discussing earlier. And so he goes on to say, a rising number of publications argue for a major revision or even a replacement of the standard theory of evolution. This is a gentleman who is not a religious person. He's an evolutionist who thinks that the evolutionary theory is no longer adequately answering the big questions. And he's also pointing out that this idea that the theory of evolution needs to be replaced is not a minority view. It is widespread. And in fact, there are scientists who are proposing alternatives. So it's ironic that while Christians are trying to force creation and the theory of evolution together, secularists are moving away from the theory of evolution, saying that it's no longer adequate. And which is another reason why our theology should not necessarily be based on science. Science is like a report of what we know at the time. But one of the limitations of science is that we never have all the data. And because we never have all the data, we will not always have the truest picture. Science acknowledges that and recognizes that in the future, what the current belief may be may change as evidence or data arises or is generated. So yes, it's a little weird that
Yeah.
this is the way that theistic evolutionists are going.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we had more time to go into some of that, but I'm watching the clock and realize that our time is winding down, and there are a couple of questions that a few of our viewers have asked. But before I get to that, one of the other concerns, observations rather, that I've made is that every now and then there is a scientific discovery that causes them to say, listen, we have to recalculate. For example, they discovered, I think sometime last year, if I'm not mistaken, some fossil of human beings, and they say now we have to rethink about the dates of when man first appeared on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
So every now and then there is new evidence, and once this new evidence comes out, oh, we got that wrong and we're changing this. So it seems to me, as you are saying, that we don't have all the facts, we don't have all the evidence, and whenever they get new evidence, they seem to make adjustments here and there. That is, to me, a sort of shaky foundation to build on.
Yeah. And, if we believe that nature is God's book and the Bible is God's book, there should be agreement. And if there's no agreement, probably the error is with our science or interpretation of the data, or even our interpretation of the Bible.
Now I posit that one of the challenges may be that because of, as we go on, when I was in primary school, we never had, to my knowledge, anything close to a cell phone. Supercomputers probably did not exist, and when they came on the scene, they occupied a space as big as the house I'm in now. So knowledge, as knowledge increases, as we are exposed to more things, we are discovering new things, and we are understanding. It is possible that we are making conclusions based on our limited knowledge, and maybe eventually things will get together and we will realize that there is no conflict at all. Just perhaps.
I agree with you 100%.
Here is a question that one of our viewers is asking. I believe this came when we were discussing the concept of the connection between humans and other species. And the question is, are not humans the only creatures that have 46 chromosomes?
I can't completely, I don't know for sure, but there are other organisms that have more chromosomes, many more chromosomes than we do. And so, they say that let me put it this way, what makes the difference oftentimes has to do with what genes are turned on and turned off. And so, and the kind of regulation, there used to be a term, or still is a term, called junk DNA. And we find that as organisms become more complex, they have this more junk DNA. And people were thinking, well, this junk DNA is just left over from the ancestral history, the evolutionary history. In fact, books were written on it, but we're finding out that this junk DNA actually has regulatory properties. And when we talk about regulatory properties, we're talking about turning genes on and off. We're also learning that the environment has a way of interacting with our DNA to turn genes on and off and even produce new traits and structures. So I wouldn't say that our specialty or specialness as humans comes simply from the fact that we have 46 chromosomes, because there are other organisms that have more.
Interesting. And it therefore seems to suggest that there is more to us than the number of chromosomes that we have.
Correct.
Yeah. Another question. Again, we could talk about some of these things more, but time. So another question, another very interesting question, not related, but interesting nevertheless. What advice would you give to an SDA Christian who is taught evolution as part of their curriculum for higher education? This is a question from one of our viewers again.
Well, as we said, when evolution is taught, there is a heavy emphasis on microevolution, which we said is an observable fact. Everything else is more of an extrapolation or an assumption. And but it is presented to us as fact. And there is a considerable amount of research being done and papers being written by other institutions like the Geoscience Institute in Loma Linda and the Discovery Institute that look at the same data and are able to propose alternative interpretations that are more in line with our Christian perspective. And I would recommend the book, Faith, Reason, and Earth History by Dr. Leonard Brand and Arthur Chadwick. It's actually free. The Kindle version is free on Amazon, and it'll give you a great perspective on how we as Christians can find that reconciliation.
Could you give the name of that book again?
Faith, Reason, and Earth History by Leonard Brand and Arthur Chadwick.
Okay, very well. Now, there are two questions here. One, I'm going to ask it just as the viewer asked it. The universe consists of time, space, and matter, but only time which is constant, as God is. Then can we infer that God's timings is most important ingredient for creation? I'm not sure I understand the question, but if you do,
well, I would say no. I would say that God's power is most important for creation. There is a discrepancy in the creation story taking place in 7 days and the theory of evolution occurring in millions of years. I personally have the feeling that if God is all powerful, then he could have actually created us in 1 day instead of 7 days, but he chose 7 days. Mm-hmm. And I think it's more of his power that is pertinent to the question.
All right, next question. Shouldn't science and theology be in harmony with each other?
Yeah, I agree. I think that they can be. It doesn't always appear that they are. And as I said earlier, where they do not appear to be in harmony can be the result, one, of our interpretation of the Bible. For example, there was a time when the church did not believe that animals could change, that there was a fixity of species. The Bible never said that, but that was the interpretation of the church. So that was an error. Or it could be an interpretation, a misinterpretation of the data. It could be that we don't have all the data, right? And I think coming back to the question of faith, we may not always get all the answers, but with the evidence that we do have, it takes us beyond the evidence that we don't have.
Another question for you, another interesting question. Who does the talking, the data or the scientists? Science or scientists?
That's an excellent question. Data is data. and it's irrefutable. It is what it is. But it is the scientist that does the interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And the limitation with the scientist's interpretation will be the amount of data available to the scientist. So maybe the data points to a red ball, but it's actually a red door. Or we interpret data based on our experiences. And so that is the filter through which we go through life. And so the scientist may have a filter that may cause him or her to ignore certain anomalies, to embrace other anomalies. I don't know if I have time to tell a story, but to illustrate that, if we do, I'll tell it later. If not, it is the scientist who does the interpretation and the talking.
Well, I tell you what, we are having a panel discussion on a similar subject at 4:30. So you're invited to come back and tell the story then.
All right.
because we are almost out of time.
Yes.
And there is a question that perhaps is going to be our final question. I say perhaps. The question is, what about the question of genetic diversity?
Yes.
That's quite a question.
What about it?
Yeah.
Well, genetic diversity is very important. I spoke about natural selection, and evolutionary theory says that natural selection is a creative force that increases genetic diversity. Those of us who believe in the creation story do not see it as a creative force, but more as a conserving force. Because as I said earlier, we are losing genetic diversity due to mutations. And so there are many who believe that natural selection prevents an organism from becoming extinct, as opposed to creating greater genetic diversity and thus new body plans and structures. I'm not sure what the person was asking.
Yeah, I mean, we can say a lot more about genetic diversity. It depends on the perspective. So, but you started a line of argument there. That's interesting. However, we don't have time to go into more details. Now, Sister Wilson, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share with us this afternoon. We didn't explore a lot of other issues that we could have. You know, there is in the creation account the whole matter of light being created on day 1, the sun being created on day 4. We have the issue again in Genesis chapter 7 onwards of the flood and how do we relate to that. We didn't get to cover all of those things, so it means that there is scope for a second presentation sometime in the future.
Okay.
In the meantime, I do want to say to our viewers that at 4:30, we do have a panel discussion. We have, Sister Wilson, I'm going to say that you will join us on the panel discussion, all right? And then we have some others. Dr. Simon is going to be on the panel discussion. We do have a theologian. We do have a medical student, a high school graduate, recent high school graduate, medical technologist, etc. It promises to be an interesting discussion. In the meantime, next week on Let's Talk, we're going to be talking about something that is very interesting. You know, there are lots of people who get married and can't have children. And so the question is it okay to find alternate methods of having children? We're going to be talking about reproductive technologies next week on Let's Talk. So we're going to be exploring the issues of fertility treatment. We're going to be talking about surrogate motherhood, artificial insemination, etc. I'm going ahead to say that we're going to have 2 weeks of this presentation because I'm pretty sure that we're not going to exhaust the subject in 1 week. And for your information, we will have as a special guest, I can go ahead and announce this, Dr. Brown. He is from the Brown Fertility Institute in Florida. So this is an individual who has performed over 10,000 different fertility treatments, etc. We will have somebody who is going to tell us how it works. And he's a Christian, so we're going to be talking about the ethical dimensions of some of the issues there. Join us next week at 3 p.m. for Let's Talk. In the meantime, please do remember that we have at 4:30 that special panel discussion. And I want to go ahead and remind all of our viewers, those of you who are listening right now, that Sunday night, tomorrow night, we begin a virtual evangelistic campaign. We're talking about Jesus Christ for the Crisis evangelistic campaign. Our laymen across Antigua will be sharing the gospel every night virtually right on this platform. So please bear that in mind. Thank you so much. Thanks for your participation again, Sister Wilson, and to all of our viewers from wherever you joined us. It was indeed a delight to have you. God bless you. See you next week for another edition of Let's